everybody, and welcome back to the Fur and Fam YouTube channel. In this week's episode, we're going to go through the steps that we took to build our bed platform. Our bed platform is also the area in which our dogs will have their space in the van. So we go through those steps that we took to build the dog box that is under our bed platform as well. So we started out by building a 42 by 48 inch box with one end being open, and we made it out of 3/4 inch birch plywood. From there, we made some framing that allows us to put our bed on top of it. And in order to attach the framing to the van, we added some plywood to the plywood that we already had on the wall and basically made a cradle that our framing sits in. And from there, we screwed everything together and made one solid platform that ties everything together on both sides of the van. So if you want to stick around and see a little bit more detail of how we did it, we're going to use a little bit of our time-lapse footage to go into a little bit more detail. So we started out by processing our 4x8 sheet of plywood, and as with pretty much everything that we're making in the van at this stage in the build, it's all starting with 4x8 sheets of 3/4 birch plywood. Now we chose birch plywood because it's a really good cabinet grade material. A lot of people use maple or oak. Birch is the other big one out of the three. If you want basically a wood that you're not going to paint, if you're going to stain everything, usually oak is much better to go with. You see a lot more grain once you stain oak than you do with maple or birch. Maple can also be stained as well, but birch usually has a pretty bland pattern to it, so that's why typically if you're going to use paint and cover up the pattern anyways, then birch is a good wood to work with there. So that's what we chose to go with pretty much everywhere in our van, because everywhere in our van is getting painted. The only place that there will be exposed wood that we're going to poly is within the insides of the cabinets. And that's just because we don't want black insides or white insides in our cabinets. Really, like if you open up the kitchen cabinets in your house now, more than likely inside of them are wood colored, because most cabinets are made with pre-finished wood panels. And now that's another thing that we're not really going to do in our van, is use pre-finished wood panels. One being we're getting all of our materials from Home Depot, and Home Depot really doesn't have any. If we went to a high-end cabinet shop to get the right panels, then yes, we would be able to find pre-finished plywood panels, and it would take a step out of the finishing process of the cabinets and make things go a little bit faster. So keep that in mind if you're trying to go for speed and you do have a cabinet shop nearby where you can buy those kind of things. They will make it go a lot faster when you start assembling cabinets. But for us, we're going to only stain the insides and paint everything else. So wipe-on poly works for us. That's what we're going to use in the inside of our cabinets. But back to the dog box. It's getting painted on both sides, because when you look under the bed, you'll be able to see the white walls, and when you look at it from the garage side, you'll also be able to see the white walls. So one step that we kind of don't really show in many of the videos is the actual designing of the pieces that we're making. So we don't just walk in the van and randomly start cutting wood and hope that it all fits together. I've got actually a notebook that contains every design and the dimensions of the van, and everywhere that I need to cut the dados and the grooves like I'm doing here. Basically tells me, it's like my very own van build guide. And that's something that Lauren and I are kind of toying with, the idea of putting together a complete van build guide. You can look at our van model layout if you go to our channel and check it out. It's one of our videos that we did really early on. Now a lot of things have changed in the model since then, few of which being the colors, and a couple of the design elements have changed. So towards the end, once we get close to being done with the van, we might do another model overview that basically will show where we started and where we ended up. And a lot of that has to do with, I've gotten a lot more familiar with modeling in SketchUp, and so that's helped out a lot with getting our cabinets designed and things like that. Basically, the vans just started to look more realistic within our model. And that's something that comes with time, with getting used to any software. Another thing that I've kind of picked up over time is the best way to use the router. So here I'm clamping on a block and letting the router edge ride against the block that's clamped on. And now to do this, you have to do some math and figure out the center of your router bit and figure out how wide your dado or your groove is going to be, and do all that math and get it just right and make sure everything's lined up before you make your cut. This was definitely a little easier than using the top roller bit and trying to measure right at the end of the board and get it clamped perfectly straight. So that was a part of the progression. And even more recently, I have created a guide that I clamp onto the bottom of my router. And then the next step would be, if I actually had a router table, could actually set the fence to be the right distance and use that to cut the dados and grooves perfectly. But the block setup that I have now that I clamp onto the router, that's probably my favorite setup so far. You'll definitely see that used in the later videos once we get to those, and I'll show you how I made it. Super simple, just clamps right onto the bottom of the router. So we've got all of those panels cut out for the dog box. Those are the 3 panels that you saw with one open end. Double checking the measurements on them here, making sure those are all right, and getting ready to use my router jig that I've made that will cut a perfect opening for a 2x4. And it turns out on my first jig that I made does not cut out a perfect opening for a 2x4. It's actually slightly larger than a 2x4. So I started running the router around. I was like, I don't think this looks right. Stuck my 2x4 in there, realized what I had done. And what I had done is I had set the depth to be where the full distance of the bit was cut out of the outside of the template instead of the inside of the template. So I was a full bit width too thick on the template. So back to the drawing board, making another template. And the reason I was making a template for this is because I knew that I would have to do it in several different pieces of wood throughout the bed frame process. So I figured if I took the time and made a quick little template, I could just zip through the rest of the side support pieces where the 2x4s sit in them, basically. And looking back on it, I probably should have just gotten the jigsaw and cut out a 1.5 by 3.5 inch opening into the plywood. It would have been a lot faster, would have saved a lot of time, and I really didn't need the precision that I was getting with the router jig. Now, looking back on it, I was excited that I just got a brand new router, and I was looking for ways to use it, and it did make a really nice template, and it did fit really well, but it took a lot of time to get right. As you can see here, I'm still making the same template, still measuring, still adjusting the router, still trying to get it to work, and by now I could have had all the holes cut with a jigsaw, and it would have been over and done with. But lesson learned, don't overcomplicate things if you don't have to. Jigsaws are great, especially when you're working with 2x4s. If I was trying to do a finished seam that you would see inside the van where it really mattered, like all this stuff is in the garage area, so you can't really tell it anyways, so it doesn't really matter that much. But like if I was working on the kitchen cabinets and I needed a perfect opening, yeah, I would probably take the time and make this jig. But for the other things, like where this is going underneath the bed where you really won't be able to see it, it's really overkill. And that's one thing I've learned on the van, is a lot of the things I started out doing were definitely overkill, definitely going to be a lot more time consuming, even down to the way I'm joining all the pieces together, the rabbets and the dados and the grooves and gluing and clamping and things like that. Those are all really good techniques for making things out of wood. A lot of times you'll see them used in really high-end woodworking. So it's definitely a very solid way to put things together, but in our case, it's probably overkill. More than likely, I could get away with pocket hole screws everywhere and a little bit of glue, and no one would ever know the difference, and it would last forever, just like the rabbits, dados, and grooves are going to last forever too. But that's all part of the build process. I'm learning as I go. It's my first van I've ever done, so it's been a learning experience. It's been fun to get to use all the woodworking tools and learn how all the joints go together and things like that. So one thing that we're doing here is making our center support that goes through the middle of the dog box. So If you watched the earlier episode where we were doing the floor framing, if you haven't, you need to check that out. It's got a lot of good information in it where we talk about our spray foam and our floor framing. But the one thing that I learned there that I didn't know beforehand is the minimum distance on center that floor joists can be. And since I'm using 3/4 plywood for the bed frame, I can use the same floor joist centering that I should have used underneath the floor, and that would be 24 inches on center. So we've got our 48-inch wide dog box, so that means I need a support down the center of it so our bed won't sag when we put everything together. In order to put everything together, we've got our bar clamps out, we're getting all our panels ready to go, we got the grooves and dados and rabbets cut in all the panels, so we're going to glue those together so you won't see any fasteners from the front or back side. That's the one advantage of the joinery that we're using. There's no open screw heads or any rabbit hole joints or anything like that that you see once it's finished, as long as the grooves and dados and rabbets are all the same size and fit together well. You do have the chance of having a slight misfit when you'll have a little bit of an opening that you have to fill with caulk later. So you can see we've got the bed platform, or really the dog box, upside down here, getting ready to glue it together. The reason that I did it upside down is because my assembly table is perfectly flat, and I wanted the top of the dog box to be perfectly flat because the floor in the van itself has a little bit of wave to it based off of how the bottom of the van's shaped and the fact that the floor did not, it was not pushed down all the way to the very bottom in all the places. So the spray foam kind of, once it locked everything together, it rose in some places a little bit where it wasn't really held down as firmly as it could have been. But the floor's not going anywhere. It's just got a little bit of wave to it in the middle. It kind of dips down a little bit. But when you step on it, it's super solid, so it's not something that we're really concerned about. But we wanted the top of the dog box to be very flat because that's what our 3/4 sheets of plywood are going to rest on top of for the bed itself. So we're putting in the cross support here that will allow us to have something for the 2x4 to screw into on that end. And another reason we put the cross support and the center support in the dog box itself is so that I could pick the whole entire thing up and put it in the van. Because if I just had 3 sheets of plywood glued together at the ends, it would have taken at least 2 people, and we would have had to be very careful not to just split the wood apart at the glue joints. And so got the 2 main joints glued up. We're putting the, I guess you could call it a stretcher, across the top there, getting it clamped in, and we're going to run some pocket holes in there to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere. And then we glue that together and glue the wood 2x4 center beam into the stretcher as well to kind of tie everything together. And one of the reasons that I'm using glue in almost every joint, even if I'm using pocket holes or wood screws or something, is so that the cabinets don't squeak. Or not really the cabinets, I guess anything wood doesn't squeak. That's something going down the road, the whole van is going to flex and give, and that's something I was really worried about because last year went out to Colorado, rented an RV, and going down 70, that thing squeaked and rattled and shook and did just about the most god-awful noise that you could ever imagine going down the interstate. And so that's something I'm really trying to avoid in our van because it just drives me nuts when things are making noise when you're going down the road. So having the extra glue there, 1, it makes the joint stronger. 2, hopefully it'll make it where you never have that wood on wood or wood on metal squeaking sound when you're driving down the road. So now we're going to take a little closer look at the dog box, the joints that we used, and how it all went together and why we did what we did when we were constructing the dog box. So behind me here we've got our dog area that's glued up and is drying now, and we'll have to wait for the glue to dry and then we'll be able to test fit it. So let's take a look at some of the joints that we use and how it's put together. The one thing about our dog area is that it goes under our bed. So that means that it's a part of the support structure that supports our bed. So we wanted to make sure that it was strong enough for us to be able to put a sheet of plywood over the top of it and sleep on it and not worry about falling through into the dog area. So that's why the 2x4 is running down the middle, and it will connect on either end to a 2x4 that then runs the full width of the van and connects to either side of the wall. The 2x4 is joined down here to this stretcher with 2 screws underneath and some wood glue. And the glue is drying in that joint as well. And then we've also got on each end the stretcher attaches with glue and 2 Kreg screws. So those allow us to get a nice tight joint, and the glue will add some strength there. And let's take a look at the joint that we used on the very back. And it is solely a glue joint. I may come back and add screws later, but what this is we cut what's called a dado and a rabbit. And the two of them fit together, and it makes a really tight, clean joint. And what it does is it allows more surface area for the glue to bond. And so that creates a really, really strong joint that's stronger than if you were to just butt the 2 pieces of plywood up together. Moving back into the van, we put up some panels on the side, and these are the walls that will go behind our cabinets and under the bed platform, basically. We didn't take too much time. We did use AB sanded plywood, so it'll at least have a little bit of a decent finish, but we didn't put too much stock in how it looks because the cabinets are going to cover it up for the most part, and under the bed platform is really the garage area, so we're not super concerned about how nice it looks. We definitely want it to look nice, but we weren't going to spend double the money for cabinet grade plywood to put on the walls. So it's just 1/2 inch AB sanded ply, and we put it on with self-tapping screws into the sides of the van supports there. And main reason is so that we have something to attach all of our, 1, the bed platform, which we're putting in now, and 2, all of our water systems, and 3, all of our electrical systems. So a lot of that stuff is going to mount in the garage area, and we wanted to have something to mount it to. So we're figuring out the distance between the walls right now and getting ready to go ahead and mount the cross members that will hold up our bed. Basically, there's going to be 3 2x4s that run lengthwise across the van, 1 on either end of the dog box and 1 at the very back to give the bed support all the way back through. And they're going to rest in a plywood cradle that we're getting ready to make that's going to screw onto the 1/2 inch sheets of plywood that we attach to the walls. So using some clamps to get everything where we need it so we can take some measurements and figure out exactly where we need to cut our cradles into the plywood that we're going to use to make the full length cradles that run the length of the van. So we're back to using our router and our jig that we used earlier. You can see it does make a pretty nice clean cut through all the stack of lumber at one time. This is nothing that the jigsaw couldn't have done again, which, looking back, jigsaw's probably way faster and probably just as precise as the router in this case. So routers are nice, but they're not perfect for everything. Keep that in mind if you're trying to build. You'll waste half a day like I am here routing out the perfect cradle for the 2x4s that no one will ever see. But it does look really nice if you look in our garage area now in the van. So it's a time-consuming process, taking out a 1/4 inch at a time on the cut, but getting through it. Basically, we made 2 1/2 inch thick cradles for each side. And the reason that I didn't just use a 2x4 for this is 1, I wouldn't have been able to cut a full 3.5 inch slot in a 2x4, obviously, because the 2x4 is only 3.5 inches thick, or wide, I guess if you want to call it. And I didn't really want to use a 2x6 or 2x8 or 2x10, something crazy big there, because where we are screwing these in, there's actually metal underneath the 1/2 inch sheet of plywood. So I really would have only had a 1/2 inch of material to screw to before I ran into metal. And so on the first sheet of 1/2 inch ply I put in for the cradle, it actually gets screwed into the metal of the van as well. And then the second sheet, it only got screwed into wood because at that point I had an inch worth of plywood to screw into. And so that made it where I could basically fully conceal the screws that were going into the metal. And the reason I wanted to do this is that everywhere that basically a heat bridge occurs all the way into the van, this will lead to condensation. So those bolt heads would have had a slight bit of water on them if the temperature differential was just right between the inside and outside of the van. And so to avoid that, I basically sandwiched the metal penetrating screws between the two sheets of plywood and then sealed it all with paint. So that will help insulate those screws and make it where they won't form any condensation. So you can see here, the first of the cradles is going in, and I left all the boards clamped to the dog box at this time just so everything would be perfectly lined up and I wouldn't have to test fit and retest fit. Just basically leave everything clamped up and put all the screws in. So put in screws, especially around the cradle areas because that's where a lot of the load is, and the actual edge that we're building up, it'll be an inch thick on either edge. Once both cradle panels are put in, the plywood will actually screw down into that for the bed platform as well. So that will be where the edge of the bed stops, basically right there. So you've got that holding it up, the dog box holding it up, and the 3 2x4s. So I think once all those things are in place, it'll be plenty strong for the two of us in the bed, and even the dogs if they wanted to jump up in the bed. I don't think it's gonna be a problem. So we've got our self-tapping metal screws that we're using here, and also the wood screws, because you can see that the metal only covers the top of that piece of plywood that we're using as the cradle. So the cradle itself, I made 7 inches tall, basically double the height of the 2x4s that are being cradled by it. And so the bottom of it, the screws are only going into the wood, so I ran those in to hold it, and then now coming back and pre-drilling all of the holes that the self-tapping screws are going in, just so that they go in straight and don't want to walk or anything silly when I go to run those in. And now the second piece going on, we're going to have just wood screws going in there and basically pulling everything down tight together so that it will seal up where the sheet metal screws penetrate into the van, basically, so we don't have that condensation issue like we were talking about earlier. Now we've got to install the final piece in the back, which is the third cross member that runs right across the back of the van. And I put a self-tapping sheet metal screw, basically toe-nailed the 2x4s into the metal everywhere. Looking back, I don't really know that this did all that much. I think the deck screws that I ran into the ends of the 2x4s definitely did much more than the sheet metal screw that went inside. Another thing that I noticed is I didn't really put that many screws around where the 2x4s were coming across into the cradle, so I went ahead and reinforced those a little bit. And now what we're doing is going ahead and getting the 2x4s, and we're going to get those installed so I can take the clamps off. And basically ran deck screws into each end of those and tied those into the plywood that we added to make one solid structure. And so that pretty much wraps up the actual putting it together. I'm checking, making sure everything's square. I'm going to go ahead and tie the dog box into that center 2x4 there to give it a little bit more strength. Making sure that the clamps pull it tight. I'm going to double check, making sure it's in the center and everything's ready to go. And then one thing that we did to kind of take it one step further, we knew we were going to have to paint the birch plywood because you'd be able to see that in the dog area. So we're sanding that, and we actually went ahead and painted the framework as well. And one reason that we wanted to do this is basically just to seal it up and keep moisture out. Because when you're building a van, it's not like building a house. You don't always have the AC running, and you don't always have the windows up when it's raining. So you can never completely keep the van at a constant moisture content. And so that's one thing. By painting everything, we'll have all the wood sealed up and know that pretty much the wood's not going to expand and contract like crazy if we do want to open up all the doors
and hang out outside when it's a humid day in South Carolina. So Lauren's getting all the walls painted. We're doing the inside of the dog box white. Um, Basically, it's going to match the walls that we have put up everywhere else in the van. And this is one area we really should have primed this first, but since it's not a super critical area that everyone's going to be looking at, we chose to just go ahead and slap some paint on it. Looking back, might should have thrown some primer on there. The paint that we're using is interior exterior Sherwin-Williams trim paint, so it's a pretty durable paint and it adheres to wood well, so it's not gonna be detrimental that we didn't put primer on it, but it might have gave us a little nicer finish when we got done painting it all. But it turned out and looked all right, and with how much you'll actually see of it, I think it's gonna be just fine. One important thing to note when you're painting is the type of roller and brush that you use can really make a big difference on the finish that you get. So here we're using a cheaper roller and cheaper brush to do the trim, and the reason being is that it is the dog area and you won't be able to see it very much, but it definitely doesn't give you the quality of finish that a good roller and a good brush can give you. Uh, One thing is on the cabinets we're using basically all of our paint supplies is coming from Sherwin-Williams. That's one thing. We went ahead and started an account there because we bought so much paint now. So we've got the primer and the white paint and the cabinet paint and all the rollers and all the other paint supplies. So Sherwin-Williams will definitely cut you a break if you have an account with them. It's not hard to set up. So I would highly advise you to set up an account with your local paint store. It will definitely make things cheaper in the long run. But back to the rollers, the higher quality rollers that we're using are a 3/16 snap mohair roller that gives a really smooth finish, and it basically gives you the same finish that you would get if you were to spray all the components that you're putting into the van. And if I had a spray booth, I would definitely opt for spraying everything because it goes a little bit quicker than rolling and it gives you a much better finish. But the things we've seen so far out of these rollers and with this paint is that it really doesn't make that much of a difference, and it really turns out pretty well for what we're trying to accomplish. So don't really have any complaints with it, and if I could spray it, I would, but for now, I think the roller will do just fine for what we're trying to accomplish. So if you liked today's video, make sure you hit that like button. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. And we've been kind of slack lately. It's been difficult getting back in the swing of things now that I'm back at work. We don't have as much time every day to work on the van, so we've been trying to balance the van and making YouTube videos and things of that nature. But definitely, if you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. And it might not be every week that we come out with a video. We're going to do our best to keep it every week. And if you have any comments, make sure you leave those below, and we'll definitely get back to you with an answer. And we definitely appreciate you guys watching, and we'll see you next week.